are talking Creep from 2004, directed and written by Christopher Smith. This is not to be confused with the found footage movie also called Creep, I believe, from 2014. This one is a kind of British slasher movie. I would say falls somewhere between The Descent and Wrong Turn. We follow a socialite as she is trying to catch the last tube to try and go to meet George Clooney and try and chat him up. But she ends up falling asleep on the tube station and gets kind of locked in. However, this is only the start of her problems. There seem to be some type of cannibal mutant that is living in the tunnels, in the underground, and also the kind of this connected sewer. She meets a few other people down there. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss. Now, I would say I think this movie is somewhat of an underrated film. I think sometimes people throw the word underrated around without really knowing what it means. I think this is actually a fairly decent horror movie. And if you like kind of slashers along the lines of Wrong Turn, but have a more of a the claustrophobic feeling of The Descent, and I would suggest checking it out because I think those who have watched it generally enjoy it. But I feel this is a movie that, generally speaking, not many people have seen. Why do I like it? What's good about it? So, I think the setup is very simple, but it's very effective at the kind of the same time. I think our main sort of character, Kate, this kind of socialite, she's somewhat against type of a typical sort of female heroine. I mean, she's not the typical sort of final girl virgin type that's always kind of like, you see in a lot of slasher films. She's going out to try and pull George Clooney, for example. Now, I'm going to come on with some criticism I've seen about that, but I actually disagree with it. But nonetheless, I think she's not typical in regards to a lot of kind of characters you see in other horror films and other characters we meet on the way as well. There's a character called Jimmy who's actually a homeless guy. I actually thought was quite an interesting and likeable character, and I wish he could have got more screen time. And then Vaz Blackwood also has a kind of quite a memorable character as well, as a kind of a sewage worker who we meet a couple of times. So I actually kind of quite liked some of the kind of the characters here. Now, the criticism about these characters I've seen is that they've been unlikable, but I disagree. I don't think they are unlikable. I mean, there's a couple of other characters who arguably say, yeah, then maybe they're a little bit unlikable, but these are just kind of like middle of the road people. They're not mega altruistic. They're just average people. And I think sometimes people will watch too many films where we have, characters that are mega altruistic and like the typical, virgin good girl, or the kind of the completely heroic guy who never is selfish and things. But these seem like more realistic people who are, not bad people, but just kind of like have things going on and are looking at their own self-preservation. Not everyone can be super altruistic. So I have to say I quite like the characters here, which is going against a critique that I have seen against this movie. And that's my reasoning for it. I will say as well, I think the acting is fairly solid. I think the cast here do a good job. Everyone here, I think, is believable in their roles. As to the creature, another criticism I've seen of this movie that I'm going to address is that the movie doesn't give you all of the answers. I think it gives you enough. And I'm going to come on to why that is in just a second. But I think the creature is, like I've said, it kind of looks like something from The Descent. This kind of mutant, pasty-looking kind of geezer. He's filmed in a way where we don't see all of him, first of all. He's just kind of like this force in the shadows. I think the way it's filmed is quite effective. This kind of, at first, unseen force, which is seemingly grabbing and killing people. In quite brutal fashion, and it's you never quite know where he's coming from. It's clear that he's been down there a long time, so he kind of knows he's adapted to the dark down there, so he has that sort of advantage, and he appears to be some type of, his body is kind of mutated into various ways without being sort of too over the top. Even some of the kind of the subtle things, I like some of the rats kind of like are trying to run away from him and stuff, and so he's often preceded by kind of like a swarm of rats. It's not like he's psychically controlling them or something. They're just kind of like he's causing them, the way he's moving around, to kind of go into certain places. And I gotta say, as the film goes on, we get some pretty gruesome and gory sequences and deaths, and I think they've even made this character, I wouldn't say the monster, the killer, whatever you want to call him, maybe not sympathetic, but you have a certain amount of empathy. And this leads me into the other criticism that I've seen of this movie about how it's not explained. The movie doesn't explicitly tell you what's going on, but it gives you some hints. And I think the idea here is that you can kind of draw your own conclusions. It's clear that there was some type of underground laboratory in this kind of underground section where, when he was a child, he was experimented on along with other kind of children. And he is just a survivor from that. Now, in some of his actions, you actually see him like mimicking like what doctors do. For example, washing his hands, even though there's no water. He puts like a breathing apparatus on one of his kind of victims, even though it's not connected. So these things aren't working, but he's just mimicking what he has seen. And so I think it's fairly obvious that you can sort of extrapolate what's kind of got on without the movie explicitly telling you that he's clearly just like the result of some type of experimentation, and he's kind of still there where everything else has just been died off and forgotten about, but he is just a remnant of this, and has kind of just survived under there, and that's why he's so feral and kind of like he's killing because he's just there to survive. He doesn't have these kind of human emotions and stuff. But again, the movie in a way is quite subtle with that. It doesn't kind of spell it out for you, and I think maybe it's missed by some people. But I think the movie has given you, where you can. He's brutal and horrific, but at the same time, you can, if you're reading the kind of the clues, you think, okay, he's a victim of circumstance at the end of the day, and he's not necessarily evil by nature, but he's feral, and he's kind of like, he's had this particular kind of upbringing. So I actually found it quite good storytelling, if you want my honest opinion, and some subtle elements where it doesn't need to spell out. You get enough information. You might not know everything, but you know enough. The actual nuts and bolts of the story, it's a simple story, to be fair, but I think it's easy. It's someone who's trapped underground, and it almost has this sort of scene at the end where things come full circle. Is all I'm going to say. And we deal with some of the kind of the homeless community, and how our main character kind of sees them, and then she ends up, she just kind of has that sort of full circle moment towards the end of the movie. And generally speaking, I think it's a pretty good scary horror movie. I think it's has some genuinely kind of quite creepy moments. There's some decent jump scares. There's some decent gore. I think the VFX are all done pretty well. So generally speaking, I think this movie is actually fairly strong. Maybe it's not as strong as The Descent or Wrong Turn. It's maybe a little bit more simple than that. Which leads me on to what doesn't work. I mean, arguably you could say that the movie is just people being chased around the underground. So the story is very simple. Maybe a little bit too simple for some. I think it works in the context of the movie that it's trying to be. But you could arguably say, yeah, maybe this could have had a little bit more, going on in regards to plot elements. But, I personally feel that it works for the film that it is trying to be. I do think there are some elements here that end up being a little bit goofy. For example, our main character of Kate, we learn that she ends up falling asleep on the station and gets locked in overnight. But there should be like fire points and things like that, and you know, fire alarms that she could have set off to get out and things like that. You know, smashed glass here, all that sort of thing. Yeah, she smokes, and she's got a lighter, so there should be sprinkles, things like that. So there are elements here that, you know, that we just won't address and stuff. She has a mobile phone, but we see her using it once, it doesn't work, and then she doesn't really try it again. Arguably, she ends up in water at some point, but so maybe it doesn't work then. But prior to that, and there's a scene with another character who, when they are running away from this creature, you know, he conveniently puts his back towards like a window where he knows the creature's outside, and obviously the creature kind of grabs him. It's like, why would you do that? So there's some kind of sillier elements here. Other than that, I think there's a little bit of kind of weak ADR. It sounds a little bit artificial at times. They had to clearly had to kind of re-record lines, and sometimes the ADR just sounds a little bit sort of weak. But overall, do you know what? I think this is a decent horror film. If you like it, kind of like a slasher that you maybe haven't seen before, I would suggest checking it out. If you have seen it, I'd love to know what your thoughts are. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. It's not a perfect film. Maybe their simplicity might put some people off. But I think it's worth a watch. 7 out of 10. What were your thoughts? Leave me a comment. I look forward to seeing you next time.